everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG, coming at you with a top 5 Pioneer deck lists for the beginning of October 2022. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative Pioneer-based videos, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below. So, Rakdos, we're starting out with number 1. Rakdos was a deck that was already arguably the best deck in the format outside of its matchup against Mono Green, and has only gotten more tools since then. This is a deck that already was featuring the likes of things like Kalia's Trader of Get in the main deck, and gets to play all this efficient black and red based removal, as well as having efficient red and black based threats like Blood Tithe Harvester, Bone Crusher Giant, Fable the Mirror Breaker, all these powerful standalone cards. And then Wizards went and added some more powerful cards to the format, like Sheoldred the Apocalypse, which whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life. Whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. Basically, this helps against problematic matchups like Blue-White Control or Lotus Field combo. Anytime they draw cards, they're taking a bunch of damage. Even for decks that can overwhelm Rakdos with just pure card advantage, this is a must-answer threat for them. Another one is the old Jund staple from the modern format, that is Lilliana the Veil, which joins a plethora of other 3-drops that already makes this deck absurdly difficult to build with the correct number of 3-drops, but is yet another powerful planeswalker to add to things like Chandra and Sorin that were already being run in some spots. Beyond that, you're just playing all the best disruption, things like Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Stomp, things like Dreadbore. Basically, you get all the greatest hits and some great threats. You pressure your opponent, and outside of your matchup against Mono Green and some other go-over-the-top decks, such as used to be Lotus Field, although they have a little bit of trouble with Sheoldred, and then things like 5-color Niv. This is definitely the best deck in the format with very few chinks in its armor, and happens to be very good against the other creature-based decks, and has a fairly reasonable matchup against the other mid-range decks other than the aforementioned 5-color Niv, and can struggle against Blue-White Control in game number 1. The other pillar of the format, love it or hate it, Mono Green Nykthos, or Mono Green Splashing, whatever color of the rainbow you want. Most notably, most of the reason ones lately have either been splashing Teferi who slows the sunset to enable the combo to go off easier, or have been playing things like Sky Sovereign, which also happen to make their Rakdos matchup even better. Having played quite a bit of Mono Green over on my Explorer channel, I found that Sky Sovereign often can clean house, even if they're disrupting your mana and doing all these other kind of crazy things. Sky Sovereign and being able to crew it a few times, killing all their conveniently mostly 3 toughness creatures, gave them a lot of fits. And then obviously the power of Storm the Festival kind of allows you to go over the top of what they are doing. Karn, kind of the linchpin of the deck, along with Nykthos generating absurd amount of mana. This giving you access to the wish board and all the various tools that it gives you access to. This deck is very powerful and is one of 2 decks in the format that a lot of people are beginning to wonder don't need knock down a peg or 2. Maybe a banning of Nykthos or Karn to kind of weaken this deck, along with maybe some tools out of Rakdos, as those decks are starting to outpace a lot of what's going on. Kind of the reason, ironically, they're doing this is both decks want you to do something else. Mono Green wants you to kind of go under them, to kill them, things like the new Gruul Aggro deck has popped up, Mono White Humans, some of the burn decks, the spirit decks, etc. The problem is, all of those decks kind of fold to what Rakdos is bringing to the table. So they have this kind of interesting dance where Mono Green's better against Rakdos, but Rakdos is protecting Mono Green's weaknesses, and both decks are kind of outpacing the rest of the format as a result. Going back down to number 5, a deck that made its first appearance in our top 5 list last month, and that is Abzan Greasefang combo. The reason this has kind of slid down the list a little bit is Black has adapted and started playing things like Leyline of the Void, which are a little bit more difficult to answer. This deck was already running things like Witherbloom, making it easy to deal with a lot of things like the various unlicensed hearses, Rest in Pieces, even things like Graveyard Trespasser can kind of be played around with like End of Turn Grizzly Salvage into casting your Greasefang. So a lot of the Graveyard hate pieces that we're seeing played just, incidentally this deck can answer, or just play things like Erupt Cane at sideboard. And when you're starting to see things like Leyline of the Void, you're more likely to have to go to things like Assassin's Trophy, which are a significantly worse removal spell because it's giving your opponent resources when they do it. But overall, this deck can win a very fast game with, milling over a Parhelion and then casting or reviving a Greasefang with Can't Stay Away. It also has this fairly reasonable mid-range plan that's just able to take over the game by casting things like Asika's Chariot, Lilliana of the Veil, and other mid-range threats you might be running in your sideboard. Number 4, kind of your token aggressive deck, and that is Mono White. Humans, this deck is very resilient in terms of with things like Brave the Elements and things like Extraction Specialists seeing play on the sideboard as well as Wedding Announcement, kind of helping a difficult matchup in Rakdos midrange. Beyond that, you're playing Disruptive Elements with things like Thalia. Sometimes you're seeing things like Skyclave Apparition in the sideboard, things like the Spellbinder, Elite Spellbinder to disrupt the opponent, Redain. This deck has a lot of disruption elements to it for whenever it needs to play against combo decks. Has a little bit of grinding elements with things like Wedding Announcement or other things like Gideon, Ally of Zendikar can often see play, or the Wandering Emperor. But, this deck is obviously weak into Rakdos a little bit, but does a fairly good job against a lot of the other decks. It can kind of run the number 3 deck off the list with its disruption, and can often go quite well against Mono White or against Mono Green if you have some of your better draws backed up by Brave the Elements. This deck can often do a lot of things, except obviously it's a little bit of weakness to the various Izzet Phoenix when that saw more play, and the Rakdos decks. But, overall, this is still probably the most solid aggro deck to be playing in the format. Remains to be seen how powerful the new Gruul deck that's popped up, the Gruul Bushwhacker deck that popped up this past weekend, and it had a little bit of finishes before that. Obviously, there are other aggressive decks in the format that can always threaten to rise up, things like Spirits, other variants of Humans, Mono Red, etc. But Mono White is kind of the best of the aggressive decks right now, and has a fairly solid matchup spread, obviously, other than that Achilles heel against Rakdos control. The other deck that kind of smacked out in the middle of our top 5 is just solid, steady blue-white control. Deck that has a fairly reasonable game 1 against Rakdos game 1, can struggle in the post-board games, but you're starting to see some powerful things like Elspeth Sun's Champion that kind of go over the top of what Rakdos does. This is kind of a card I mentioned last month that could kind of be an answer to what that deck does. Nice to see it seeing play here, as opposed to when things like Liliana make Dream Trawler and the big crab a little bit more useless. But overall, Elspeth is a very nice card in that matchup. You get to play things like Lyra and Baneslayer Angel on the sideboard. Starnheim Unleash is a very powerful late game spell. But, this deck is obviously fairly decent against the creature-based decks. Can struggle a little bit against mono green. You have to answer them step for step or just get run over. One of the newer kind of comings and goings of the deck is Saw It Coming, kind of replacing some of the copies of Zorb. This allows you to play a cheaper counter spell in the mid game by obviously foretelling it in the early turns. Still obviously having access to Censor and Dovin's Veto. The one weakness of this deck continues to be its early base removal. Obviously Portable Hulk can hit anything 2 or less, but it's its sorcery speed. March of Otherworldly Light helps out in that regard a little bit, but it can be a little bit prohibitively expensive where you have to pitch cards. So, one of the weaknesses of this deck continues to be its 1-for-1 based removal. It's not as good as something like Esper or Dimir in that regard, but it does trade that by having some of the best sweepers in the game with Supreme Verdict and Farewell, in addition to having access to powerful planeswalkers like the Wandering Emperor and Teferi Hero of Dominaria. Decks that have notably fallen off of late, things like Izzet Phoenix, the various Spirits decks, etc. Now, all of those would probably be lurking in the top 10 of a lot of our lists, but, right now the format is kind of dominated by the Twin Towers, and everything else is kind of falling off a little bit in the fall of that. Like I said, they kind of protect each other a little bit with what they're doing. Mono Green, kind of was what the format revolved around, but now it's kind of like this Twin Suns approach where Rakdos, kind of pounds on the aggressive decks that Mono Green can struggle with. Mono Green kind of picks on the other go-over-the-top decks like Lotus Field and 5-color Nib that might otherwise get Rakdos fits. So overall, I think until one of those decks gets shaken up, or maybe both, with a banning or some other powerful strategy kind of pops up, I think those decks will continue to kind of outpace the rest of the format, and until something else rises up or somebody finds some way to attack the format in some other regard, I think those decks will continue to be far and away the best things. And then 3, 4, and 5, it's just kind of arbitrary, other powerful decks. Obviously, not saying these decks can't win tournaments, but you're much better served to be playing Rakdos or Mono Green if those are kind of decks that fit your style of play. As always, if you like these kind of videos, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below.